Good afternoon, everybody. Actually, it's good morning in Arizona and it's good evening in the UK. Thank you very much for joining us. This is really such a pleasure. I've been an admirer of Philippa Gregory's amazing work for years. And to introduce her, I'm going to do it sort of by time zone. By centuries. Time zones are a huge problem with Zoom. Anyway, she has written Plantagenet and Tudor series, including the War of the Cousins. That's 1430 to roughly 1568. The Order of Darkness, 1460 to 1461, the Tredescant series, which I truly love, 1603 to 1638. Currently, the Fairmile series, which is what we're going to be talking about, Dawnlands, Book 3, from 1648 to 1685, and then she leapt ahead into the 18th century with the Whiteacre trilogy, 1772 to 1805, and she's written modern novels and a work of history and other historical novels. And although she began publishing in 1987, you may know her work best from The Boleyn Girls, which has been the other Boleyn Girl, which has been made into films. This year, she was awarded a CBE. So for those of us in America, Philippa, who don't know what that is, could you explain it?
There are various orders of merit awarded by the Queen to people who she particularly likes. It's not that personal. They're nominated by their communities or by their colleagues, and they run up to dames and knights. So you get knighted at the very top of it, and one below that is Commander of the British Empire, which is what she was gracious enough to award me.
How wonderful for you that you received it from her while she was still doing it.
Well, in the last year, yeah, it makes it extra special, actually. Yes, it does.
Of course it does. Gareth Russell, who we have not met before, is, sorry, I have to switch gears here, is from Northern Ireland. He published his first work of nonfiction in 2014, and in 2019, his account of the Titanic disaster. You're from Belfast, right? Where they actually built it.
Yeah, I'm actually 2 streets over from where they
That's right.
Right
I've been through it. Was named a Book of the Year by the Times and a Best History Book of 2019 by the Daily Telegraph. In 2022, his biography of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was published. He's the playwright and the author of 2 novels, but I think he probably best intersects with Philippa's work with his An Illustrated History of the Tudors, published in 2014. So Dawnlands, I think, which is the third in the Fairmile series, has a gorgeous cover, which probably is getting too much reflection. And Philippa was kind enough to sign book plates for us. So if you order your copies, we still have some and we can get more. We have signed book plates. So welcome, both of you. I was going to tell, excuse me, Philippa briefly, on my first foray to England on my own, I rented a car at Gatwick Airport, and totally virgin to driving on the left side of the road, or in fact, driving on English roads at all. I left Gatwick Airport for Eastbourne, where I was going to stay at a wonderful place. And my first place of refuge where I could turn off and kind of breathe, and maybe practice parking or something, was Hever Castle. It's right on the road there. And I've retained this real affinity for Hever Castle and the Boleyn family, because while I was there, I thought I might as well totally immerse myself in whatever Hever Castle had to offer. But I found it a place of real succor, which maybe is not what most people think of the Boleyn family or Hever Castle as, but it was for me. Anyway, Gareth is going to be questioning Philippa, and after a while, Patrick will come back with your questions or comments, which you can enter into the comments field, and he'll reappear. So Gareth, over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and it's lovely to feeling to say meet always still feels strange on Zoom, but it is lovely to meet you, and the book is absolutely fascinating. I wanted to talk a little bit about the period that you picked, Philippa, because it's so, for people who haven't had a chance to pick it up yet, it covers actually quite a condensed period of our country's history, 1685 to 1689. And as we said, I'm speaking from Belfast tonight. And in this part of the world, the ghosts of that decade are still very potent. It probably, I mean, there are marches in the road outside every July commemorating one of your main figures in William of Orange. What do you think attracted you to the 1680s? Because I don't think I'm sort of speaking out of school here to say that it is a period that we would know is very, very important in our country's history, but it's certainly not one that gets a lot of attention, I think, before Dawnlands.
Absolutely. I mean, I think any civil war is of enormous interest if you're writing a family history at all, because families are divided as the nation is divided. And so I started this series, the Fairmile series, with a book called Dawnlands, which was set in 1640. And my intention was that it would be a common family, a working family, and that we would trace through a lot of books, a number of books from the 1640 to their rise, which comes, as did so many other families, with the British Empire and colonialism, the expansion of trade. And then I found, because I'm a historian, because I can't stop myself really, that I had set this character in 1640, and over the Solent in the Isle of Wight at the time was Charles I, imprisoned, fighting for his life, trying to avoid execution. And into her life, therefore, came a royalist spy. And the whole story developed and became very, very clear to me only really now that in a time where the monarchy is a tyranny, if you want to tell a family history, you always end up being involved in the history of the royal family as well, because what they do determines everybody's lives. So this book, I mean, I agree with you, James II isn't well known, and his second wife, Mary of Modena, even less.
Yeah.
But actually, their decision to push for Roman Catholicism in a country which is absolutely determinedly Protestant brings the end of the Stuart line, brings two rebellions in this book, not just one, which are fundamentally the refighting of the English Civil War with a different Stuart and a different government.
Well, it's interesting. That was actually sort of, not that we didn't plan this. That's like a perfect segue into my next question, which is one of the things I think that this series does, that, again, sort of not to harken too much on the Northern Irish thing, but it really struck me because it's perfectly done in these books, is that you deal with the inheritance of generational trauma, and you deal with the inheritance of prejudice, and that these very, very intense questions that Britain grappled with about monarchy and religion echo down the generations for this family. Was that something, I mean, you're saying obviously the idea develops, you know, the story develops as you write it. Was that something you were interested in writing as you started this series?
It's really interesting you should say that, and it's really a great compliment. And I hope that it's true also for the American readers, because we have a theme throughout the two books of the series of one of the English characters comes to America and is involved in the first American war against the indigenous people, called King Philip's War, which, although also not very well known, is the most deadly, is the most fatal for people in American history. So yes, I mean, I think any serious family saga is going to be about generational trauma, because one of the things that identifies a family is not just being born of each other, but the inheritance you carry. So I wasn't conscious of that, but now you said, I absolutely see that's what I was doing, and that's really what the story is about. So there's sort of now thank you for you saying it. You always know what you're writing when someone else reads it.
Every time.
It's so powerful, isn't it? It's extraordinary. So like what I thought I was doing is I thought I was writing a story of a family who goes from poverty locally into global and wealth over generations, slowly, with each expansion being explained by the reality, the political and the economic reality of their time. But also, you're absolutely right, what each generation does is understands and reinterprets the things that have gone wrong before in a way which either resolves it for them or intensifies it for them, as trauma does.
Well, I think that is certainly the question of resolution versus reviving it. That is something that does seem to really percolate in Dawnlands. And there's a brilliant, I mean, there's a quote from quite early on in the book, but you say really, so 1685 when the story begins, King Charles II has died, and the stark choice, not just that your characters face, but the country faces, to crown the unpopular Roman Catholic brother instead of the adored Protestant bastard son. And really what seems to be happening here is an eternal political question, which is, what sacrifices morally do you make, or are you comfortable with making in order to create a better society? And I think that was something that really, because on the one hand, you could see absolutely James II is supposed to be the next king, but he's manifestly unsuited for it and extremely unpopular. And so I think it just was such an interesting reflection on the cost, I suppose, that we're willing to pay for our political beliefs. Was that something that you found maybe one or two characters were more involved with, or less so?
I think, some of them, of course, are fictional characters and are there to be, as well as moving the story along, simply entertaining. The character of Livia, the Italian widow who bursts in upon the scene and, is absolutely Cruella de Vil and Maleficent, rolled into one sexy widow. She's just a delight to write, and I think everybody loves to read Livia.
Yeah, she was my favorite to read about. I loved it. She really was delicious.
But equally, she couldn't operate in the way that she operates if there wasn't, in a sense, a terrain of uncertainty, which comes about from this very question you put, which is, how do you want the country to be? And at its simplest, people answer it in terms of Protestant or Roman Catholic, or not democratic, but certainly a constitutional monarchy, a monarchy of limited powers. And then in addition to that, who do you like? People find James II intensely dislikable, and they find James Duke of Monmouth intensely likable. Interestingly, when William of Orange comes to the throne as a constitutional monarch and as Protestant, everybody goes, yeah, we'll have him, but he's really horrible. So there's that problem, which I think particularly my American readers in their feedback to me sometimes struggle with, which is, how is it that you have a leader who isn't the one people like the best? Because it's a monarchy, it's not a democracy. And one of the tasks of monarchy in this book and in today is how to be liked, how to get people to feel you deserve the position you occupy.
Which is interesting, because I think it's absolutely true, but we always forget that William III was sort of seen as a cocktail of boring and unlikable all rolled into one. But he was, for Protestants, the best of or they felt he was the best solution.
I think he was the only solution to the difficulty of having another Stuart clearly pushing Roman Catholicism and clearly verging on tyranny. And what we'd seen with the Monmouth Rebellion was that the power of monarchy was enough to turn out the armies. I think if James Duke of Monmouth had escaped and returned, he might have won the second time.
I think you're probably right.
As it was, they had a sort of a halfway house in that William of Orange was married to James Stuart's daughter Mary. So you had this sort of fig leaf of inheritance, which is one of the reasons, I think, why we don't know much about the last Stuart, about the end of the Stuarts, because the Hanoverians who come in after Mary, who are even less related, and who then lead on ultimate to the Saxe-Coburg-Gothas, who are rename themselves as Windsor. The desire for monarchy is to conceal these massive breaks and complete changes for the benefit of saying it's hereditary, we've always been here. And during the funeral of the late Queen, there was a lot of discussion about how the throne went back to the Tudors, and you go, really not, don't be impolite, but really not.
No, it's a skimming stone. It's interesting, because sometimes you have to say, look, the inheritance is the fig leaf, but the real body is what's convenient to the country and the dynasty. You're absolutely right. It's not. I think as someone asked me, I did the maths once, how many times it's gone father to son, and it's the minority. It's really the minority how it's transferred. One of the things I love the most about the book, and I think people are really going to enjoy, is, to me, it felt like the best kind of an adventure, because there's such a panorama of settings. You have obviously the stately home in Yorkshire, you have a tumultuous London, but we also get to see New England and Barbados in the 1680s. Can you talk a little bit about your research and what you enjoyed writing about 17th century Boston and Barbados?
Well, I knew from the very beginning that this was a series which was going to go internationally, because it was going to follow the prosperity of Britain and the British Empire. So I had already had a book. Dark Tides is set very much in New England and in the colonial borders, really the expanding borders of New England, at a place called Hadley, where we met for the first time the Pokanoket people, and I went to New England and met with the Pokanoket people and got permission from them to tell their story, and they were very, very generous with their time and their history with me. So I had a real sense of what that culture, the pre-colonial culture, was like, and then a real sense of the devastation of the war, which meant that when I came to write the character who comes from New England into England in this book, I had a real sense of her family and her past, as I had a sense of the English past. She gets involved in the Monmouth Rebellion, and most of the people involved in the Monmouth Rebellion were transported in servitude to Barbados, interestingly enough, with a lot of Irish, of course, who are always rebels and always in a sense, the white slaves of the British Empire also. So she gets transported to Barbados, and I, you'll be proud of me as a fellow author that I made the enormous sacrifices of going to Barbados.
Oh.
I know. And I had a simply wonderful time there, but also just there's nothing like going to a place when you need to write about it. So everything from the sky and the color of the earth and the history of the sugar plantations was incredibly fruitful, and I think added a dimension to the novel, which was exactly where I've been heading all the way along, which is that this is going to be a series which takes in the expansion of Britain overseas and then its subsequent shrinking.
Well, that's particularly interesting, because I think, from having read some of your earlier novels, but that's more the earlier the medieval setting, you do sometimes forget how small the world was in comparison to the medieval mindset, and then you feel it just seems to be getting bigger all the time. And I thought just to be going from Yorkshire to Barbados was a real joy in the book. We talked about her briefly, but Livia was one of my questions, because she is a perfect mixture of glamour and terror, I think, sort of woven into one very morally nebulous character. I know your PhD is in 18th century literature, and I sort of felt with Livia, we were getting back to, I mean, it's a bit more 17th century, but the best kind of a restoration anti-heroine. She's loathsome, but you can't really take your eyes off her when she's on the page. You've said she was a joy to write. What was it about Livia that you enjoyed writing beyond the obvious? And were there any real life inspirations for her, or was it purely fictional?
I think she's probably a literary trope. I don't think I can even take credit for her. You say I hadn't thought of the 17th century villainous women. Of course, she's also liaison dangereuse.
Yeah, absolutely.
She's Madame Merle. She's a little bit later on. She's Rebecca in Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. She is everything that the respectable English reader fears and adores simultaneously. She's foreign. She's very foreign. She's very glamorous. She's very sexy. She manages her sexuality in the way that English literary heroines do not. I think I'm a very bad feminist to write her. I'm positively ashamed of myself for succumbing to the temptation to write a woman who is sexually active and wicked, and virtually incredibly mercenary and absolutely selfish. But of course, she is the very thing that English men, I think, fear women are, and English women long that they could be, but believe it is out with their entire repertoire. So she's just great to imagine.
That's so I hadn't thought about Rebecca from Daphne du Maurier. There is that kind of
absolutely.
Absolutely.
She's literally the Italian widow who comes in married to your brother, and you don't know if she's killed him or not. As they do, these Italian women.
That's so good, because I thought, I mean, she sort of reminded me a bit of the Mancini sisters, who were this sort of like rambunctious tribe of socialites in Louis XIV's court, who, if there was any whiff of a scandal, you could be sure one of those sisters was nearby. to move to the other Italian character in it, Mary Beatrice, Mary of Modena, who was James II's wife, is probably, I think, our least known queen consort, despite the fact that she was our last Catholic queen. And I found she almost is in some ways the anti-Livia, I think, because while she is Italian, she's someone of very intense political and religious beliefs, intensely modest. What kind of research did you do before writing Mary Beatrice, and what made you want to make her, or give her probably, I think for the first time in fiction, make her a central character?
There's only 2 biographies about her, and one of them is very much worse than the other. Which is pretty, I mean, they're very old biographies as well. It's not that anybody's going to be knocking on my door.
Sure.
Safe enough. But she isn't much regarded. I think one of the reasons she's not much regarded is because there is a real longing to, in a sense, get the Stuarts off the throne and forget them. And of course, she went to France with her husband, the king, and they lived in France. I mean, I've just gone Wallace Simpson for Livia also.
Yes.
Exactly. Anyway, so Mary Modena goes
so
to France and lives in France with the king and raises the Prince of Wales. I mean, undeniably, he is the legitimate son of the King of England. He is the Prince of Wales. And he's the one who keeps coming back and having these doomed attempts at retaking England. Sometimes, I think, at least on one occasion, coming in from Ireland. Yeah. And the Stuarts remain the princes over the water, absolutely adored, but never actually supported for literally centuries. It becomes a sort of a dream of, it would all be better if we could get the Stuarts back, but we never do.
Right, but could I interrupt for just a moment and say, because it occurred to me when I was writing this up, I did sort of a riff on, I think Charles II failed in his primary duty as a monarch, which was to produce an heir. And I've always wondered why he didn't divorce Catherine of Braganza, who was clearly, because he was Catholic and because she was Catholic, I think. But the warming pan baby, it seemed to me, because we're in the middle of this ghastly election, was a classic of misinformation. I mean, it was so contemporary to read about, that, and that was one of the things that pushed the Glorious Revolution and, got them off the throne, was the question of whether this baby, as I understand it, she was too modest to give birth in public or refused. And
no, that's still more fake news. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary how powerful the legend about the warming pan baby was. She gave birth in the royal bedchamber in the presence of, and these are just some of the names I'm going to list for you, most of the Privy Council, not the Archbishop of Canterbury, because he was imprisoned in the Tower by her husband for being head of the Church of England and not Roman Catholic. Sundry ladies in waiting, 3 or 4 ladies in waiting, couple of midwives, couple of attending doctors, her husband who held her hand at the head of the bed throughout, and her mother-in-law. And everybody stood around and waited for this baby to come. They folded the bedclothes up to her knees so that everybody could see the baby come out. And the baby came out, as they do, if it's all going on. And then subsequently, the rabid, vitriolic Protestant gossip, including her stepdaughter, Princess Anne, which is just such a low blow.
It's horrific, really awful.
It really is. Circulated this belief that a maid in waiting had dashed in with the baby in the warming pan, shoved it in the bed, zipped it out of the warming pan, taken a girl baby, if girl baby there was, and away. And that incredibly unlikely story just absolutely gained hold, and so much so that today, you having researched it, honestly think that there's, that there aren't people there to see the baby. The poor James, I mean, it's unlike me to say poor James for a king, but poor James felt obliged to call a government inquiry, and they all gave evidence as to who had been there and what anybody had seen. And that's why we know that the bedclothes were folded up to her knees and who was there, because they all had to say what they saw. And what they saw was a baby being born in a perfectly normal way.
And also to give an idea of just how long it rumbled down the centuries, I didn't know until the most recent book I worked in, The Queen Mother, that the last time the royals had to give birth with a witness was Princess Margaret in 1930. The Home Secretary was sent up on the overnight train to Glamis Castle and had to wait outside while the then Duchess of York, the future Queen Mother, gave birth to Princess Margaret.
So he actually waited outside. They weren't all in the room.
But the doors had to be open. Yeah, that was Queen Victoria finally said, I think, by the way, these princesses need them to wait outside. But yeah, no, the door was open. He could hear, you know, you sort of like the Queen Mother only died in 2002. But yeah, the consequence of the warming pan baby was there always had to be witnesses at royal births until the late Queen's father cancelled it. And I think Princess Alexandra Philippa was the first one born without it. So yeah, isn't it
extraordinary? You know, look at the power of the election deniers that, you know, I mean, you know, a completely untrue statement that has echoed all the way through our politics for the last, you know, couple of years, despite all proof to the contrary. It's just amazing to me.
It isn't, except it absolutely confirms the belief that, you know, a lie is halfway around the world before truth gets its boots on. If you say something that's not true loud enough and often enough, apparently, you know, you get away with it, even in this day and age, even with this amount of scrutiny. It is really extraordinary.
Well, because I think the more, I mean, also, I don't want to give away, there's a brilliant plot twist with the way you dramatized the warming pan baby scandal. I don't want to give that away. But there are little touches even of humor in these dark moments. There's a bit where Livia is so intent on seeing the birth that she like smacks the midwife's hand out of the way. And I thought there were really lovely moments of humor peppered through this. Do you think there's a moment of, even in very difficult times, there is humor? It's like people laughing at funerals sometimes, I think. I thought that was brilliant.
I took a decision quite a few books ago that my historical fiction was not going to fall into the trap of previous historical fiction. I'm thinking of the books that were written around about the 1950s, which I read when I was a girl, and which, when I came to historical fiction, was very much how it was done. And there's two things that I really dislike about them. One is they're incredibly snobby. So they're very deferential towards monarchy, and the queens are always pure and lovely and always in a good mood and speak beautifully. And you know, gentlemen are always gentlemen. And it completely denies the naturalness of life at whatever level of class you are. And it completely denies the horror of exploitation of the wealthy, of the poor, which by actually saying these people are born to monarchy and it's right that they should be there and they're absolutely lovely, completely denies any claim for rebellion. So I said, I'm not going to write snobby historical fiction. And I said also, I'm not going to write respectful historical fiction, in that funny things don't happen, because funny things happen in every walk of life at all the time. And I think one of the reasons that you get, one of the ways to get a sort of realism in historical fiction is to show the awkward, silly moments where things go wrong. One of my favorite characters in the novel, which doesn't appear very much, is a real character, Catherine Sedley, who is James II's mistress. And she was notorious for her misbehavior and her loudness and her vulgarity. And I just loved writing her. You know, because she's so fun, because she's a complete reversal of what, when we do these sort of historical reconstructions, what we think the court is like. You know, it's not always dignified. It's quite often bawdy and loud and people messing about and playing stupid games. And in her case, you know, yelling. People really disliked the fact that she would gamble with the king's money and shout when she won. You know, that sounds to me like a real character, in a way that some of the more old-fashioned historical fictions give you really a set of stereotypes.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a great quote about the historical James II. I don't know if they were talking about Catherine Sedley, but they might have been. Which is that, first of all, James II's mistresses never get any attention compared to Charles II's from our writers. But someone said, some court wit said that his mistresses were all so ugly or so annoying that they thought his confessor had assigned them to James as penance.
That's Charles II. That's his brother, the king, said that.
Did he say? Wow, that's horrible. That's harsh.
It's really harsh. It's really harsh, especially when you think that Charles II, the older brother, famously glamorous and handsome, had this succession of extraordinarily beautiful and sexy mistresses, some of whom went to bed together for his amusement. I mean, James must just have felt he must have had such younger brother syndrome. It just must have been crippling.
Well, I think he does emerge as a very disgruntled younger son, younger brother. And there is a sense, I suppose, with James, to sort of link back to that generational trauma, there is a sense that, you know, of all the royal children during the Civil War, he was the one who was really kind of the last one they got out of the Civil War safely. And he saw a lot of his father's imprisonment. There was a real sense here, as elsewhere, that he is trying to actually refight the Civil War. He's almost trying to settle something that he's been dealing with since childhood. And it is, I thought the James that we have in this book is very awkward. He's a very awkward man. He does cold, I think. I find him very close to what we know of the James II. How did you research James when you were prepared? Because I suppose he's everywhere in the book, really, in a sense, because it's him that is the focus of a lot of people's ire.
Yes, I mean, I think when you're writing in a period of tyrannical monarchy, you can't get away from the royal family because they run the show. And I expect, as my books come past the Glorious Revolution, past 1688, through to more constitutional monarchs, that the actual personality of the monarch will matter less because they have less impact on political life. You know, that's when you start getting into, well, what does the Prime Minister think, and what mood is Parliament in, and what does the electorate think? It starts to become more important. I mean, I researched James very directly from biographies, and everybody was very clear that, I mean, he's so much older than Mary of Modena. He comes to the throne so much later. He's had such a terribly traumatic childhood. His father, Charles I, calls him to him on the eve of Charles I's execution and says, if they try and crown you, you must refuse it, because they'll try and crown you and then you will have disinherited your older brother, and you must never do that. And I'm going to die tomorrow. And you know, the biographers say that Charles wept over them, and you go like, how incredibly self-indulgent. You know, if you know you're going to be executed the next day, to have your James and Elizabeth come to you and have a nice cry. I mean, the Stuarts, I just think the Stuarts are despicable, but that's me. But certainly, you know, a traumatized boy, he gets out of England very courageously, but also very luckily. They disguise him as a girl and bundle him out of England, and he gets away. And then he has this completely wasted life, as does Charles II, when they really think they're never going to get back, because they think the Cromwellian settlement is going to be permanent. And they're always raising money for an invasion. They never quite get enough money for an invasion. They never think it's quite going to happen. And they're just very, very lucky that Oliver Cromwell dies without getting an adequate settlement of the kingdom onto his son, which was by then his intention. And you know, Charles II is invited back, and he comes with almost no conditions. He just like dashes in.
It's sometimes you don't realize just how touch and go the restoration was. I mean, it really was an extraordinary thing that he pulled it off in the way that he did.
Yes, and I don't think he pulled it off very much. I think basically what you see there, though it's very concealed, is the fact that power is really shifting to the elite lords, and it's Monk and the Cromwell's generals who go like, we can't maintain a non-monarchy settlement. We'd better get Charles back, and we'll tell him the rules. And Charles goes, yes. Yeah. How much will you pay me? And that's when you start the civil list, which is such a bugbear even today.
Yeah, absolutely. And then
pay somebody to be King of England.
Yeah, and it might be Charles III that buries that from Charles II, because apparently he wants to end the civil list and just fund the monarchy from the estates. So it could be we are burying the civil list on two Charleses, which could be very interesting. But one of the things that I thought the book also captures is a really interesting moment when you start to see, I think it's really interesting in the characters of Livia and Mary Beatrice, that you see a tension between the absolute certainties of religious faith that had gone before and a more secular pragmatism that's starting to become more apparent as we approach the Enlightenment. Mary Beatrice's faith, I think, was particularly that she's in a moment where she's almost delirious and she's talking out loud in a way you get the impression she's not usually that honest. Do you think that really it was a question of religion or politics that fuels the story forward, or are they impossible to separate?
I think it's ahistorical to separate them. I think
Yeah.
until the Enlightenment, until you have a more secular society, you can't separate religion from politics really at all. Mary Beatrice not only did she not want to marry James, like nobody would have wanted to marry James. Nobody did want to marry James.
No.
He actually offered round a bit before they settled on Mary Beatrice.
Because she wasn't a very high-ranking princess. She wouldn't be the first one you would go for. No,
wasn't the first one he went for. She wanted to be a nun. She committed herself towards the life of the convent, and she was only persuaded to marry James by the Pope himself, who wrote to her personally and said to her that it was her mission to go to England and convert the heathens of England from Protestantism back to Catholicism. So she starts off at a terrific disadvantage. Not only is she young, not only is she a second wife, she's the same age as James's daughters. So she's, she has no internal heft or political power, but she's also sent on a mission which nobody could have achieved.
No, absolutely not.
It was wicked to think that a young woman could even attempt that. And I think as so far as is it political, it is terribly political. It's toxic, because by then the English have decided that it is the intention of the French to get the English returned to Catholicism and ultimately take over. And James and Charles, of course, lived in the pockets of the French court on the French money for all of the period of exile, and carried on. All the courtiers took a salary from the French king, who absolutely saw the future of expanding Catholicism into England and ultimately expanding French influence into England. So it's a time when you can't really separate religion and politics anyway. And I don't think anybody would. I think there is a sense that Catholicism leads you sort of automatically to a sort of tyranny, because of the idea of the great chain of being, whereby kings are appointed by God and they are second only to angels and far above mortal men. And once you buy into that idea of a hierarchy of a spiritual power, then you've really lost all hopes of any sort of democracy of civil power.
Well, before I open it up to wider questions, we've talked a little bit about your career writing so many novels. I just wanted to throw in my 2 pence, which is that a few years ago, I wrote a biography of Catherine Howard, which we very kindly gave a quote for. But your portrayal of her I did Young and Damned and Fair a few years ago.
Such a good biography. Yes.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. That was.
I'm sorry, I didn't associate you with that. It was indeed a long time ago, but and such an interesting character, Catherine Howard.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And also, I wanted to say your portrayal of her in The Boleyn Inheritance is my personal favorite fictional portrayal of Catherine. Of all the queens that you've written about, is there one that you particularly enjoyed writing and researching and left with reluctance? Because it's always painful for writers sometimes when you have to move on if you love the character.
I don't think I ever don't love the characters. What's really interesting to me is, even when I start with reservations, once you dig into somebody and come to know them, you can't help but love them. I mean, I think Catherine Howard's a wonderful example that when I started researching her, I was probably thinking of her rather in the terms of David Starkey, who dares to call her a slut, a stupid slut. And you just go like, what do you know about anything that you would call a young woman who died at 16, 17?
Probably that. Yeah, between 17 and 19 is the upper limit. Yeah,
absolutely. There's no understanding of nature there, I think, at all. And so I started off with Catherine Howard going like, I'm not sure what there is to find out about you. And then, of course, you find out there's this incredibly complex and abused childhood. And and the abuse which literally goes into her marriage, where she's married to someone who is a known wife killer. It's the most extraordinary thing that could happen to a young woman. So I think all of them, I sometimes start with more or less enthusiasm. Catherine of Aragon, I started with enormous enthusiasm because I knew she was a incredibly heroic character, and all I learned about her just increased my admiration of her. Catherine Parr, I mean, absolutely unsung heroine of feminism and English literature, the first woman to publish in England under her own name, and almost nobody knows that. I can't understand why she's not, why there isn't a statue for her in front of the British Library. I mean, just an extraordinary career. There isn't one of them, Anne of Cleves that, that we always remember what Henry said about her. So we remember what the wife abuser said about her, but we don't know what she said about him. Who survived him and ended up at the coronation of her stepdaughter. It's such a triumph. They're all, because they're all complex women, when you start to look into them past the stereotypes, you can't help but love them, because they are complex and interesting, and all of them extraordinarily courageous just to survive.
Absolutely. Well, Dawnlands is an absolutely fantastic book. I'm sure I just loved it. It was just such a pleasure to have this conversation. But I think I have to open. Oh no, thank you. I think I have to open up to questions now.
We're going to bring Patrick back to do that, but I wanted to ask Philippa to speak a little bit about Eleanor. We've been talking about, the royal family, but I love Tidelands. I thought it was an extraordinary book, and she is a wonderful character. And we meet her when she's, so young in difficult circumstances, and her choices are really what drive this series forward to Tidelands and now this book. So could you speak a little bit about Eleanor, because she's a character that is connecting these books, and presumably if you're doing a generational saga, she'll continue, or she'll die and her progeny will continue.
Yes, absolutely. Her progeny will continue. She does start, she is in Tidelands as the sort of matriarch of the family. She is the founder of the story. And we first meet her, and she's a very poor midwife in a very poor remote area of the British Isles. She's on the south coast of Sussex, which then is quite desolate, quite poor. And her mistakes and her decisions and her choices mean that at the end of Tidelands, she's exiled from her community. And we next meet her in Dark Tides, when she's managed to get to this warehouse on the side of the Thames, and her daughter and she are running a little wharf with coastal trade. And Livia comes into their life and in a sense expands the possibility of the wharf and the wealth in general. And then when we get to Dawnlands, Eleanor is now an old lady, in that period really very old. And we find, I think what's very heartwarming for me is that, although it's taken me 3 books, there's a bit of a resolution for her, that she ends up almost as the lady of the house where she had been a very despised servant. And she ends up resolving the question of the unhappy love affair that she had in book 1 in a way which I think really reflects her dignity and her growth, and the failure of the man to step up at the right time to love her.
Did you read, or you probably did, because it was such a hit, such a potboiler, Forever Amber, umpteen years ago? But if you did, you would remember that there was a bit of a similarity there, in that there was a man like that and a young woman somewhat like that, and all the way through, he never steps up, in a way. And I think, even though it was a tremendous potboiler, and not really a scholarly work in any way, I thought that it did a terrific job in illustrating what you were just talking about, and how hard it was to survive as a woman, to make choices and survive them.
I think the man who doesn't step up is probably as much of a fictional trope, and possibly in real life, as the Italian widow.
Absolutely.
All right, Patrick, that's your cue. Step up, step out, step up. It was perfect.
Okay. Well, what a fascinating conversation. There have been a lot of comments that are just people expressing how much they admire your work. And one question that's come in, though, a gentleman named Ian would like to know, are there any plans to return to the Order of Darkness series?
Do you know, it's so interesting. More people have asked me about the Order of Darkness series on this book tour than I've heard from in years. I don't know why everybody wants the final book. I am remiss to Ian and everyone else, I hold up my hands here. I planned it as a 4-book series, and I have written and published 3, and my characters are currently hanging in limbo, and they're on their way actually to Transylvania, but I haven't set them off yet. And I have promised myself, and I promise my readers, that I will get to book 4 and I will conclude that series next year.
Wonderful.
Let's see. Another question's come in about adaptations of your work for the screen, the big screen or the television screen. Any news on that front?
There's a few possibilities. There's certainly a possibility of the Fair Mile series going into a television series, which would be really great. I'm very careful now who I partner with, because I don't really want any alterations to the history. I don't mind people adding their spin on the fiction, but it's very painful to me when I have to defend the historical content in an adaptation. So that's a possibility. And there's an American production company who are interested in Wideacre after all these years. So there's a couple of possibilities happening now, and I'll let you all know how it goes.
We have one question about your children's books. Any future plans to write another one?
The children's books are something that are on a bit of the back burner. I've just completed a series based on the Princess Rules stories, and they've been very, very popular, and they were a joy to write. They're absolutely lovely to write, and I have grandsons now and they want another one, so I imagine I will have to write another one. But right now I'm very, very absorbed in writing a non-fiction, a history book of the women of England, and that's taking up absolutely all of my time for the rest of this year and half of the next. So some of these things have got to be parked, unfortunately.
Right.
When you say a history of women, can you be a little more specific, Philippa?
I can be terrifyingly specific. We
Oh,
start in 1066 with the invasion, with the Norman invasion, and I'm going to go through to 1992, which is the year that women are ordained for the first time in the Church of England, which is to accept for the first time that women have souls and can communicate directly with God and can, in a sense, pass the Spirit of God through them. And you think it takes us 9 centuries for men to regard women as spiritual beings. It's extraordinary. So it's not going to be, there's a lot of books which do lists of great women. It's not going to be a list at all. It's going to be a discussion of the centuries and how what women's rights advance in the centuries, what goes wrong for women in the centuries, and how these various sort of myths about women's nature develops over time. It's fascinating to research, but as I say, immensely time consuming.
Do you have help doing research, or is it all you?
I have no help. Nobody.
I have a team of researchers helping?
No, I wish I had a team of researchers. The thing is that so often with research for me, I find I want to know about something in a general area, and it's only when I've read 3 or 4 books that I find the thing that I'm interested in. So what I can't do is I can't say to a researcher, go and have a look. And if you find something that would interest me, let me know. You know, they're never going to do that. So for instance, the other Boleyn girl, I was going to write a book about a female pirate. And so I was looking about a history of the Royal Navy, and I came across Henry VIII launching a ship which was called Mary Boleyn. And I went, I've never heard of Mary Boleyn. Who's Mary Boleyn? And if I had given that task to a researcher, I would have had a lovely file about women pirates and the Royal Navy, and I would never have heard of Mary Boleyn.
So it's often the little detail tucked away, waiting to be discovered. It'll take you down a rabbit hole.
It's always a little detail tucked away that takes you off. And I always notice when I'm researching, when I go, oh, that's interesting, but it's not what I'm working on. I now know to always make a note of that, because that's the thing that's going to stick in my mind and that I'm going to want to check up on later. It's extraordinary.
It's not
Gareth,
just
you find that to be true as well?
The research, yeah,
your
absolutely.
research.
Yeah, absolutely. I knew exactly what Philippa meant when she said it just wouldn't work. On the one hand, you would love the researchers, but actually, even with, I think it would be the same with nonfiction and fiction, because I mean, you'll know this better than I will, Philippa, but sometimes you will find little things that you think, oh goodness, that it leads you down a rabbit hole. For instance, with the Catherine Howard book, I was able to put that I did a few years ago. I was able to put in a lot about etiquette manuals, because when I was researching, I came across a casual mention that there were still surviving some textbooks they used to use to teach aristocratic children how to behave, but that wouldn't technically have flagged up for a researcher of what I'd asked for. So in many ways, it's like you're sort of like a breadcrumb trail, really, of trying to find what'll interest you.
Absolutely.
It's organized chaos is the best.
Yes, I mean, not even organized chaos. I think there's it's almost dawn of the world chaos. You know, you want a sort of primordial soup and you'll see what crawls out, you know, and you have to. I think the more experienced I get in research and writing, the bolder I get about going like, well, I don't need to decide yet where this story is going to go or where this research is going to go. I'll just, you know, noodle around and see what takes my fancy.
You know, as a reader, it's interesting. I love the other Boleyn girl. And I think, you know, it's a fascinating story. But the character that I really want to follow from that is Henry Lord Hunsdon, because I think he is an extraordinary figure. And yet we hardly know anything about him. And think of the irony. If Mary Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's older sister, actually had a healthy son from Henry VIII, but he was never able to, you know, to inherit.
It's even more ironic than that. Someone wrote to me that the heraldry on his tomb in Westminster Abbey is that of a royal bastard. So when Elizabeth was on the throne and he knew that he was a royal bastard, so he didn't have a claim greater than her, but he was male. He never ever mentioned it. Nobody ever mentioned it. It was the sort of thing nobody spoke about, because she notoriously arrested and executed rival claimants. So only on his tomb, when he was safely dead of natural causes, did he put anything like a claim up. Isn't that fascinating?
That would be a good book title, The Royal Bastard.
Too many of them.
Are there?
You'd have to have a subtitle to like narrow it down. Yeah, there are plenty of them.
The Duke of Monmouth would have been so much better a king than, you know, than James. I mean, the Stuarts were cursed by bad luck and bad judgment, and at the end of their lives by sterility. They got rid of the, you know, the warming pan baby through this disinformation category, but William and Mary didn't have children, and poor Anne had some kind of ghastly, she and her husband, probably some sort of, you know, blood disorder thing. Would she have 18 children, all of whom died?
Yeah.
Which is why we, you know, eventually got the Hanoverians going all the way back to Sophie and Charles the First sister. But you know, they were just a cursed family, all the way from Mary, Queen of Scots, it seems to be going forward. What if her husband? They
invited a lot of the curse in themselves. They did. You know, they were.
To be fair, when she married the heir to the French throne, she couldn't anticipate that he would die. And you know, think how history would have been different if he hadn't. Yeah, she just stayed Queen of France. Yeah. You know, history's so full of accidents. That's what's so, you know, completely fascinating. Part of it's bad choices, but a lot of it is just stuff that happens to you. And
absolutely. And one of the tricks of writing historical fiction is acknowledging the sort of serendipity of the events. At the same time, you know, if you're writing fiction, you can't just go, this happens, then damn it, that happened. Right. And Lord, that's just happened. You know, you have to like find a thread through, but that's actually probably not what history is like when you're living it. At the time, it probably feels completely random.
It does. I think resilience, you know, has so much to do with what happens, you know, who is resilient and who isn't, who catches luck, but you can't, it doesn't do you any good to catch a break if you're not resilient. You know, Charles II, the merry monarch, but in many ways, you know, a terrible king because he didn't actually do the things that he should have done. So, you know, there's a lot of myth in history too, a lot of myth that survives. So I think your books are marvelous, Philippa, and I'd really encourage any of you who are watching this to read the Fair Mile trilogy from the beginning, to read Dawnlands, which is wonderful. And I'm sorry, what's the second one? The Dark Tides, and then Dawnlands. I mean, you can read Dawnlands as it stands, but I think it'll be a richer experience if you actually read all three. And we do, as I pointed out, I have to do a book selling moment here. We do have signed book plates, which are wonderful. And thank you very much. What a pleasure it is to have hosted both of you, new to us, but we hope not for the last time. We'll get a chance to talk. So thank you for joining us. I know, Philippa, you have another engagement, so I think we'll sign off and let you catch your breath, right?
Thank you so much. It's very kind of you. It's a pleasure to meet you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very
Thank
much.
you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.